The second game we will look at with the 6 E3 variation comes to us from the Czech Republic in 2004. Peter Kellner playing white, Milan Spal, a master, playing black. Let's take a look. D4, G6, C4, Bishop G7, Knight C3, C5, D5, Bishop takes C3 check, B takes C3, and of course F5, fighting for control of E4. White plays E3, and again, E3 does block in the bishop on C1 and take away potential development squares F4, G5, and H6. D6, Bishop D3. The reason people play E3 is they want to rapidly develop with Bishop D3 and usually try for E4 at some point. A logical plan, but again, it's a bit slow and cumbersome. Knight to F6, Knight E2, a bit of an unusual development for this knight. And now, black, very opportunistically, takes advantage of the opportunity to immediately establish the powerful pawn duo on E5 and F5. White has a choice. Allow black to have that type of space advantage in the center, or, as in the game, play D takes E6. However, after D takes E6, Bishop takes E6, two things happen. One, the bishop gets developed and immediately puts pressure on the C4 pawn, and two, the black knight has a more active possibility of developing to C6. So remember, once this D5 pawn is gone, two key things to remember. One is your knight can often come to C6, and two, this bishop quite often can relocate powerfully to C6. More on that later. Castles, Knight C6. Already we can see from here the knight can go to A5 or to E5, increasing the pressure on C4. Knight to G3. Again, quick note, if knight F4, no big deal. Just back it up, Bishop F7. You still have good control over the D5 square, and the knight could be subject to a kick at some point in the future. So, in the game continuation after knight to G3, black castles kingside. Note that with the pawn on E3, the bishop has trouble getting out to H6. In fact, white now played Queen E2, preparing, of course, the E4 pawn push. But probably was more prudent, or certainly worth considering, to play the immediate E4, freeing the bishop. After Fe4, Knight E4, Knight takes, Bishop takes, it does involve a pawn sacrifice on white's part. After Bishop D5 check though, Bishop takes, Queen takes, black now has a choice. King over, or Rook F7. Preference would be, surprisingly enough, for King H8, which of course, this looks very dangerous putting the king on the long diagonal. But concrete analysis is required. After C4, for example, black counterattacks with Queen F6, actually attacking the rook on A1. If Rook B1, now the rather surprising at A to E8. If Bishop B2, we can simply play Knight D4. This idea of using the knight to jam up the long diagonal is a recurring theme again and again, and very important idea to remember. After Queen B7 here, for example, Rook E2 would be very strong. Or, if we go back, after Knight D4, instead of Queen B7, well, start with notice that Rook D1, threatening Rook takes D4, of course, is not too dangerous because, one, we just play Knight E2 check, King over, and we actually grab the offending bishop. So let's go back. Instead of Bishop to B2, suppose white had grabbed the pawn on B7. This also looks very promising. He can now play Bishop B2 next move, and meanwhile he's penetrated to the 7th rank with his rook. This also looks very dangerous, but keep in mind, the black pieces are fully developed and occupying open files. The knight is developed, could swing to D4 if needed. And in this exact position, the white king also has problems. Queen takes F2 check, Rook take, Rook E1 check, Rook back, and Rook takes Rook back rank mate. That's right, sometimes it's very important to remind the opponent that he too has a king that needs to be looked after. So, let's go back to the game continuation. After castles, white played the preparatory Queen E2. Black now played very nicely. Knight to g4. Very active relocation of the knight. Threatens to swing the queen into e4 and also creates a possibility of knight to e5 hitting the sensitive d3, c4 points. Of course, black could always increase the pressure, on the c4 point with moves like knight a5 and the bishop on e6 is already attacking. So knight g4 really activates the black position. And in addition, it prepares the little surprise that after e4 by white, f4 is a very powerful response. This does two things. One, remember we said this bishop was boxed in? It stays boxed in because with support from the rook, the pawn just blatantly pushes forward. Two, it also embarrasses the poor knight. As we see, the knight really has no squares except the sad knight back to h1. Tactically, he could have played knight f5 offering a piece sacrifice, but then black would do well just to stick with the program, and once the knight moves, for example, knight h6 check, king g7, white is faced with just a whole bundle of trouble. To start with, his knight is trapped. Secondly, his bishop and pawn are under pressure. Thirdly, the f-pawn is anxious to just plow ahead to f3 and break up the white king side. So going back to the game, after the powerful counter f4, the knight had nothing more than the sad retreat. But now, the heavy artillery comes in, and the direct threat of queen takes h2 mate rears its ugly head. Now, you would expect the normal defense here with h3, and that would be met by the very powerful f3, totally cracking up the white king side. After g takes f3, for example, you then have the very nice attraction sacrifice. By attraction, we play knight h2. This attacks the rook on f1 and the pawn on f3. And by attraction, what we mean is that we pull the enemy king, or say the enemy queen, to an unattractive square. And in this case, we pull the enemy king to h2. After king takes h2, that allows us to play queen takes h3 check with tempo. Okay, and then after king g1, knight e5 is just a powerful crushing threat on the f3 square. Note that f4 doesn't help because after knight f3 check, white has nothing better than to cough up the queen. Note in this situation that the white units are unable to come to the aid of the poor queen and king in protecting this f3 square. After queen h4, white came up with the ill-conceived bishop takes f4. However, after rook takes f4, h3, simply knight at g to e5, white now resigned, realizing that after g3, queen takes h3, g takes f4 is simply the same motif. Knight f3 check, supported by the queen, and white has nothing better or no choice rather than just give up the queen. Therefore, after knight at g to e5, a piece down, king under attack, white simply resigned. A powerful performance by the master, Spal, playing black. Let's take a quick recap. After knight e2, black very astutely played e5, establishing the dynamic pawn duo in the center. White had the unpleasant choice: allow black to maintain the space advantage, or in the game, d takes e6, bishop takes e6, and after castles, knight c6, and the black pieces were very active. The next important point was when white built up to play e4, black played the very astute and very active knight to g4. This really activated the black position and allowed him to meet the central thrust e4 with f4. A powerful, powerful move that forced the white knight back to the edge of the board. And then, of course, simply devastating queen h4, followed by your typical h3, f3, breaking up the king side. Again, just a very, very powerful, very brief performance by the player playing black.